A police officer shot a girl in a wheelchair for suspicious movements, but he didn't know who would come for her at the hospital. On that day, the silence was louder than the gunshot. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The afternoon in Rosefield, a small Georgia town that rarely made the news, drifted in with a heavy stillness that only the southern heat could deliver. The cicadas droned from the trees that lined Maple Avenue, their endless chorus weaving into the muffled hum of distant traffic. Old brick buildings stood stubborn against the sun, their windows reflecting hard light across the sidewalks. Children just released from school scattered through the streets with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Mothers hurried them along, fathers leaned against porch rails with folded newspapers, and the town itself seemed to breathe in that slow, sleepy rhythm of a place convinced that nothing remarkable would ever happen there. Amara Johnson's wheelchair rolled over the uneven pavement in front of the Rosefield Public Library, the small motor humming softly as she pressed the joystick forward. She was 13, though her thin frame and the way her braids fell unevenly around her face made her look younger to anyone who didn't know her. Her eyes, wide and curious, carried a quiet determination. Resting carefully on her lap was a sketchbook, its cover bent from use, the corners smudged with charcoal. Inside were the drawings that belonged to her alone, images she refused to show her classmates no matter how often they asked. She drew heroes, girls with hearing aids that glimmered like crowns, warriors who carried canes like staffs, guardians who sat proudly in wheelchairs and still towered above skyscrapers. Her heroes looked like her, and she carried them with the kind of reverence that other children reserve for saints. The sun pressed hard against her pink hoodie, too heavy for the day but worn because she liked the way it felt like a shield. She maneuvered onto the square where the light stretched long shadows across the stone steps of the library. With her free hand, she signed the rhythm of a song she had memorized weeks ago. Her fingers traced the melody in the air, movements precise and tender, the only way she ever sang. Those who knew her recognized it instantly. They saw her often, moving home along the same path, her hands lifting into the sunlight as though she could sculpt music from silence. There was no fear in her motions. For Amara, the square was safe. She lived with the certainty that this town, no matter its flaws, had carved out a place where she was visible, where people smiled at her even if they didn't understand the words she spelled in the air. That day, an older woman watering the flowers outside the laundromat waved, her face lighting with recognition. A pair of teenagers passing on bicycles slowed, watching her with curiosity, but rolled on without malice. It was nothing unusual. A quiet ritual on a quiet afternoon. The patrol car appeared without ceremony, a dark Ford idling to the curb at the far end of the square. Inside sat two officers. Philip Miller gripped the steering wheel with impatient fingers, his jaw locked, the muscles twitching beneath his skin. Next to him, Officer Dean Hardy scrolled through a department-issued tablet, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. A new alert had pulsed onto the device moments earlier, stamped with the seal of Helix Dynamics. Subject identified, behavioral anomaly. Non-compliant hand motions. Possible threat. Black female. The words blinked across the screen as though they carried gravity, though they were nothing more than lines of code pretending to be foresight. Hardy hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but Miller didn't wait. He cut the engine and stepped out, boots thudding against the pavement. His gaze locked onto the small figure in the wheelchair, onto the way her arms moved in patterns he could not decode. To him, the gestures were not music. They were signals. The unease bred by the system's language had already done its work in his mind. Suspicion clung to him like sweat. Amara, unaware, spun her fingers upward, catching the light as though she were plucking stars from the air. Her sketchbook slipped slightly forward on her lap, and she reached to steady it. Miller's hand found the holster at his hip. Hardy called his name, low and uncertain, but the sound was swallowed by the throb of cicadas and the echo of footsteps in the square. Miller raised the gun. The first shot cracked through the still Georgia afternoon with the violence of something out of place, shattering the illusion of safety that had held for so long. The bullet struck Amara in the chest, the pink fabric of her hoodie blooming red as though a cruel hand had painted her with a brush dipped in blood. She jerked back, the wheelchair shuddering from the force, her sketchbook flying from her lap and spilling across the concrete steps. Pages scattered, drawings of heroes with outstretched hands fluttering into the dust. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. Even the cicadas seemed to pause, as though stunned into disbelief. Then came the gasps, the shrieks, the sound of feet pounding against pavement. A mother clutched her child to her chest and ran. A teenager dropped his bike, the handlebars crashing against the curb. A man cursed loudly, fumbling for his phone. LaToya Brooks, the cafe owner who always watched Amara pass by her window, burst from her shop still wearing her apron. Her phone was already in her hand, the camera recording. She knew what she had seen. She had seen the girl move her hands in rhythm to a song, the same way she had every afternoon. And she had seen an officer shoot her for it. She screamed words that cut through the chaos, words that would be replayed 1,000 times in the days to come. She's deaf. She was signing. You shot a child. The officers froze in the moment of their ruin. Hardy's face blanched, his hand gripping Miller's arm with desperate force. Miller's mouth moved, but no words came out that anyone could hear above the roar of the crowd. His eyes darted from the girl's body to the phone recording him, to the growing circle of witnesses pressing forward with fury on their tongues. Amara lay crumpled on the concrete, the metal of her wheelchair twisted, her head tilted to the side. Her hand twitched once, not in defiance but in the failing static of nerves refusing to go silent. Her hearing aids had fallen, one skittering across the stone steps with a faint metallic buzz before it died. She could not hear the chaos rising around her, could not hear the sirens that now screamed as other squad cars rushed into the square, but she could feel the ground vibrating beneath her body, the deep hum of fear and rage moving through the people who watched. The square became a fracture in the town's history. What had been a routine afternoon dissolved into a scene of panic and accusation. Protest rose not from speeches, but from the sheer presence of witnesses, their voices uncoordinated but undeniable. Someone sprayed words across the library wall with shaking hands. Justice for Amara. Others lifted their phones higher, recording every angle, every detail. By the time paramedics arrived, the town was already split open. The girl on the ground was no longer only a daughter or a student or a child who loved to draw. She had become a symbol, though she had never asked for it. As medics pressed gauze against her wound, shouting over the rush of blood that refused to stop, the officers were pulled back toward their cruiser, faces pale under the weight of what they had done. The crowd pressed closer, shouting louder, and though Miller muttered about compliance, about signals, no one listened. The ambulance doors slammed shut, carrying Amara away, her blood still staining the square. The sirens wailed, pulling her down the street, but the noise that remained behind was louder. It was the murmur of anger rising into shouts, the beginning of chants, the pounding of fists against walls. The small Georgia town that had believed itself quiet discovered in that moment that silence was never protection. It was only the pause before the roar. And so, in the span of a single shot, a girl who wanted only to draw heroes and sing with her hands became the center of a storm she could not see, one that would pull her father from the shadows, one that would unravel the town's illusions and expose the machinery hidden beneath. The square was no longer just a place for children to play and mothers to sit on benches. It had become the first chapter of a story that would stretch far beyond its borders. A story that had only begun with the sound of a gun and the silence that followed. The ambulance that carried Amara away left behind more than the echo of its sirens. It left a vacuum in the square, a silence filled not with calm but with a tension that spread quickly through the town like a crack through glass. People dispersed reluctantly, some clutching their children, others with phones still raised as though the act of recording had become a shield against disbelief. Spray-painted words on the library wall already dried under the heavy sun. Justice for Amara. It would not be washed away easily. Rosefield had been marked, and though many tried to convince themselves it was an accident, too many had seen otherwise. Hundreds of miles away, in a nondescript building without windows in Northern Virginia, a man sat in a dimly lit office. Malcolm Johnson had spent years inside rooms like this, spaces where silence meant more than conversation, where decisions were made in whispers that could alter the shape of nations. He had once been a central figure in the government's hidden machinery, a man who knew too much about how intelligence was gathered and twisted, about how patterns became verdicts before courts could even intervene. But he had walked away. After his wife's death, he had folded up that life like a uniform no longer fit to wear. He had chosen to raise his daughter in quiet exile, far from the war rooms and shadow councils. Now, as he leaned over a folder of declassified reports he had promised himself never to reopen, his wrist vibrated, not with the ordinary buzz of a phone notification, but with a coded pulse he had not felt in years. His head snapped up. The implant. The emergency signal buried in his daughter's cochlear device, one he had designed in secret as a safeguard when she was little more than a toddler. It had been silent for more than a decade. It should never have activated unless the unthinkable had happened. He didn't panic. Panic was foreign to him. Instead, Malcolm closed the folder with deliberate care and slid it into the drawer. He stood, pulled his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out without explanation. He didn't need to give one. Those who knew him understood that when he moved with that kind of precision, something irreversible had already taken place. Within the hour, his name had been removed from the visitor logs, his credentials deactivated, his desk already reassigned. It was as though he had never existed there. The Gulfstream jet lifted off from Andrews under low cloud cover. No manifest, no markings. Malcolm sat alone in the cabin, eyes fixed on nothing, replaying 1,000 memories he wished he could silence. He saw Amara as a baby, her tiny hands grasping his finger. He remembered her at 5, learning to sign words faster than he could keep up. He recalled the nights she drew pictures under the kitchen lamp, insisting that heroes should look like her, should move in wheelchairs and sign their strength with fingers instead of fists. He had promised her a world where those heroes could exist. And now she lay bleeding in a hospital bed because the world had decided her language looked like a threat. When the jet touched down at the regional airstrip outside Rosefield, the town was already convulsing with rumor. Social media pulsed with fragments of footage. Hashtags flickered across screens. Justice for Amara, hands are not weapons. News vans lined up outside the hospital, reporters fumbling for information. Police barricades rose quickly, officers speaking into radios with tight jaws, their words drowned by the growing crowd pressing against the tape. Malcolm moved through it unseen. Years of practice had made his presence easy to blur. He wore jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and carried nothing but a guitar case slung across his back. Inside was no instrument, only the tools of a man who had once made systems vanish. He entered the hospital not through the main doors where cameras clustered, but through a side entrance, the badge of a night janitor borrowed through channels no one else knew existed. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and quiet panic. Nurses rushed past, their faces drawn, whispers of the girl trailing in their wake. On the 4th floor, Trauma 1 was sealed. Malcolm caught sight of her through a narrow pane of glass, his daughter pale against the sheets, wires tethered to her chest, machines breathing rhythm into her silence. For a moment the air left his lungs, and the years of discipline cracked. He pressed his palm against the glass, not in farewell, but in an oath renewed. He would not lose her, not this way. Dr. Olivia Merriweather led the surgical team, her hands steady though her mind trembled with the weight of a name. When the intake nurse had whispered Malcolm Johnson as the emergency contact, she had felt ice trace her spine. She had heard of him in D.C. circles, rumors of a ghost who had once authored predictive models for counterterrorism, models that were said to have vanished with him into silence. She wondered what kind of man could disappear so completely. Now she understood, the kind who would move heaven and earth for his child. Malcolm wasn't alone. He had called 2 people the moment the signal reached him. Serena Hale arrived within hours, her sharp eyes already scanning hospital systems through the laptop balanced on her knees. She had been one of the few he trusted when he still wore a badge of authority. A cyber specialist, brilliant and untamed, she now worked freelance, carving out her own empire, dismantling corporate firewalls. When he asked for her help, she didn't hesitate. The second was Robert King, a veteran-turned attorney who had spent years dragging police departments into courtrooms they swore they would never enter. His voice carried the weight of service, his files the weight of truth. He met Malcolm in the hospital parking garage, his handshake wordless but solid. Together, the three formed the nucleus of something larger than revenge. It was strategy, shaped by grief and precision. While Amara lay between life and death, they worked. Serena cracked into the Rosefield Police Department's internal system with the ease of someone who had outgrown such games. Files spilled onto her screen. Incident reports, dispatch logs, automated alerts from Helix Dynamics. One line repeated itself in chilling simplicity. Behavioral anomaly detected. Non-compliant hand motions. Risk classification. Elevated. The subject profile. Black female. Approximately early teens. Wheelchair. The justification. Erratic gesture pattern. Possible signaling. Robert read the lines aloud, his jaw tightening with every word. Malcolm said nothing. He had seen this before in another form. During his career, he had watched predictive systems reduce human beings into data points, had seen how a misread gesture in Kabul or Basra became the excuse for a drone strike. He had walked away because he knew it was only a matter of time before those same systems were turned inward. And now it was his daughter's blood that stained the proof. The more they dug, the clearer the shape of the conspiracy became. Captain Harold Wells, head of the Rosefield precinct, had authorized the pilot program with Helix Dynamics. No council vote, no public notice, just a signature buried in discretionary budgets. The alerts officers received that afternoon had not been random. They had been seeded by an internal flag Wells himself had typed into the system minutes before the shooting. Amara hadn't just been unlucky, she had been hunted. Outside, the town's unrest grew louder. Teenagers from Rosefield High poured into the square, carrying hastily made signs. Mothers wheeled strollers alongside grandmothers holding rosaries. The chant began awkwardly but quickly found its rhythm. She was signing! She was signing! The words echoed against the library's brick walls, shaking the fragile illusion of order the police tried to hold. Inside the hospital, Malcolm stood over his daughter's bed, one hand resting on hers, the other gripping the silver ring he had carried since his wife's death. He remembered Marlene's voice, remembered how she had insisted they both learn sign language before Amara was even born, how she had believed that their child's world should begin with understanding rather than adaptation. Marlene had died in silence too, her break lines cut after filing a complaint against a deputy who had assaulted a deaf student. They had called it mechanical failure. Malcolm had known better. He had swallowed that truth, buried it with his career, and promised himself never again. Now the shadow he had once been was rising again. He would not remain invisible, not while his daughter lay broken because a system had decided her voice was dangerous. He turned from the bed, his eyes meeting Serena's and Robert's. He didn't need to say the words. They understood. The return of the shadow was not for vengeance alone. It was for revelation. The world outside still believed what it had been told, that silence was safety, that accidents happened, that compliance was survival. But Malcolm knew better. Silence had never been safety. It had always been the weapon used to erase. And now, with his daughter's breath held by machines and her blood still drying on the square, he would turn that silence into a weapon of his own, one the town, the state, and the country would no longer be able to ignore. The night settled over Rosefield with the weight of a storm building. Police lights painted the streets in frantic flashes. Protesters refused to leave, their stillness louder than chants. Inside the hospital, Malcolm pressed his hand once more to the glass of the surgical suite. His daughter's chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. He whispered a vow only to himself. Tomorrow the world would know. The hospital never truly slept. Yet in the hours after Amara's surgery, there was a heavier kind of quiet, one that clung to the walls like smoke after a fire. Machines hummed softly around her, blinking lights marking the fragile rhythm of her pulse. Malcolm sat beside her, his face carved into stillness, his mind already several steps ahead of the present. Serena hunched over her laptop in the corner of the room, fingers moving with mechanical precision as lines of stolen code and documents poured across her screen. Robert stood near the window, arms crossed, his gaze alternating between the parking lot below, where reporters and protesters gathered, and the hospital corridor, where police officers had begun to linger, as though proximity could rewrite what had happened. The weight of everything they had uncovered pressed into the air, dense and undeniable. The first evidence had been damning enough. The internal alerts, the fabricated flag labeling Amara's hand movements as erratic signaling, the logged entry from Captain Wells minutes before the shooting. But Serena dug deeper, pulling at threads that most would never have found, hidden inside unused folders, encrypted backups that Helix Dynamics had lazily trusted to their partners in Rosefield's precinct. Within hours, she had enough to make any lawyer salivate internal memos that described children like Amara as non-compliant profiles, system manuals that instructed officers to treat repeated gestures as possible gang communication, and financial reports linking discretionary safety budgets directly to Helix's pilot program. It wasn't just incompetence, it was deliberate design. Robert read every line, his jaw set tighter each time he turned a page. For years, he had faced police departments in courtrooms, had heard the excuses rehearsed like scripture. The suspect was non-compliant. The officer feared for his life. The system flagged a threat. He had argued against them with what little evidence families could scrape together, and too often he had watched the cases dissolve into silence. Now, for the first time, he held proof so damning it burned in his hands. Malcolm studied the files without expression, but inside his chest the silence roared. He recognized the language of the documents too well. He had helped author frameworks not unlike these in his former life, back when predictive threat indices were used overseas to flag insurgents before they acted. The technology had always been flawed, but its danger multiplied when paired with bias and fear. He had left before he saw what it would become, but now he knew his absence had not slowed its spread. It had only allowed it to turn inward, to hunt children in his own country. His own child. Outside, the protests swelled. What had begun with a few students scribbling words on the library wall had erupted into a gathering that stretched across Rosefield's downtown. Teenagers marched with cardboard signs scrawled in marker. She was signing. Mothers pushed strollers draped in cloth that read, "Hands are not weapons." Elderly churchgoers sat on folding chairs, rosaries and Bibles in hand, their presence as fierce as any chant. The noise was not deafening. It was measured, deliberate, a silence that echoed louder than shouting. They stood still, hands raised in the air, fingers spread open. A town that once prided itself on quiet compliance now discovered how powerful its stillness could be when sharpened by grief. The police tried to control the narrative. Press releases spoke of a tragic misunderstanding, of possible gang-affiliated gestures, of officers acting within protocol. Garer, local media repeated the words cautiously, unwilling to accuse, unwilling to condemn. But the internet had no patience for caution. Latoya Brooks had uploaded her video, shaky but undeniable, of Amara in her wheelchair moving her hands with grace, of Miller raising his gun, of the shot that shattered the afternoon. By dawn, it had spread beyond Rosefield, beyond Georgia, across the nation. Malcolm watched the footage in the dim light of the hospital room. He did not flinch when the gun fired, did not look away when his daughter fell. He had trained himself to consume horrors without reaction, but when the camera lingered on the scattered pages of her sketchbook, drawings of heroes bleeding into the concrete, he felt the weight of his silence bear down on him. He closed his eyes and exhaled once, a soldier preparing for the next phase of battle. They could not allow the story to be written by those who had fired the shot. Serena organized the files into packets, cross-referenced with timestamps, backed up across secure networks. Robert prepared statements, drafted legal motions, assembled the beginnings of a case that would not be buried. But it was Malcolm who decided the timing. "Not yet," he said, voice low but final. "We don't strike until they commit to their lie. Then we burn it all." That lie came quickly. By morning, Captain Wells stood before cameras, his uniform crisp, his words rehearsed. He described Amara as non-compliant, insisted the officer feared for his safety, claimed her hand movements resembled signals consistent with gang affiliation. His voice was measured, but his eyes flickered with unease. He did not know that Serena had already pulled the original dispatch log, proving the first alert had been manually entered under his login. He did not know that Malcolm held emails with his signature, authorizing Helix Dynamics to operate without oversight. The press conference ended with Wells insisting the matter would be reviewed internally. For Malcolm, that was enough. The gasoline had been poured. It was time for the match. The release was quiet, almost surgical. At exactly midnight, Serena uploaded the unedited footage from the cafe's street camera, paired with internal documents showing the false flag. No commentary, no slogans, just raw truth. From there, it spread like wildfire. By dawn, it had reached millions. Hashtags flooded timelines. Justice for Amara. Hands air not weapons. She was signing. News anchors stumbled over the footage, their voices breaking as they tried to explain what millions had already seen with their own eyes. The eruption was immediate. Protests spread to neighboring towns, then to cities across the state. In Atlanta, students gathered outside the Capitol with their hands raised in silence. In New York, subway riders stood still on platforms, signing simple words they had only just learned: justice. In Los Angeles, candlelight circles formed outside libraries, children holding sketches of superheroes with wheelchairs and hearing aids. The country had seen enough bodies fall to gunfire, but this time it was different. This time a child's silence had been criminalized, and that silence now spoke louder than any bullet. Helix Dynamics scrambled to defend itself. Executives issued statements blaming algorithmic misinterpretation, insisting it was a beta program not meant for field deployment. But Serena uncovered more: training manuals that explicitly instructed officers to interpret sign language as suspicious, budget memos that showed city funds diverted from school safety programs into Helix contracts. Each revelation struck like another blow, dismantling the corporation's excuses before they could form. Malcolm moved among it all like a shadow, unseen but always present. He did not join the marches, did not hold a sign, did not speak to reporters. Instead, he walked the periphery, listening, watching, ensuring the story spread without distortion. He had spent his career hiding truths in code, burying secrets in places no one would find. Now he was unearthing them, one file at a time, each release timed to slice through the lies the city tried to weave. Amara lay still in her hospital bed, her chest rising shallowly under the weight of bandages and wires. But even unconscious, she became the center of a movement. Her drawings, recovered from the square, were photocopied and taped to protest signs. A sketch of a girl in a wheelchair catching stars appeared on banners outside the courthouse. Another of a hero signing words of strength became a symbol shared online by millions. Her art, once hidden in the pages of a private sketchbook, had become the language of resistance. By the third night, the protests outside Rosefield had grown so large the streets could no longer contain them. The police stood rigid behind barricades, but they did not advance. Perhaps they feared the cameras, or perhaps they feared the silence that confronted them. Hundreds stood with hands raised, unmoving, the weight of their stillness heavier than any chant. The square where Amara had fallen glowed with candlelight, each flame a small act of defiance against the darkness that had tried to swallow her. Inside the hospital, Malcolm received a final file from Serena. It was worse than even he had imagined. An internal strategy memo from Helix Dynamics, signed by Mayor Evelyn Brock herself, described the program as a community stability initiative, language designed to mask its intent. It encouraged officers to act on non-compliant behaviors, to establish visible authority by confronting at-risk youth. The translation was simple. Children like Amara were targets by design. Malcolm closed the file, his expression unreadable. He stepped to the window and looked down at the crowd, at the sea of raised hands glowing in candlelight. For the first time since the shot had been fired, he allowed himself a breath of something close to hope. The eruption of truth could not be contained. The lie had already collapsed. What remained now was to ensure the world understood, not just what had happened, but why. He turned back to the bed where his daughter lay, pale but breathing. He reached for her hand, pressing the silver ring of her mother into her palm. "You are not just a victim," he thought, though he did not speak the words aloud. You are the reason they cannot hide anymore. The movement outside was not only for her, it was because of her. And though she could not yet open her eyes to see it, the world had already begun to change in her name. The fourth morning after the shooting, the hospital awoke to the sound of chanting outside its walls, though it was not a chant in the usual sense. Hundreds of voices gathered, but they did not shout. Instead, they stood in deliberate silence, their hands raised in the same signs that Amara had once traced on her way home. Nurses looked down from the windows, their eyes filling with something they could not quite name, something between grief and recognition. Reporters pushed past barricades, their cameras pointed not only at the protesters, but also at the hospital itself, where they believed the girl at the center of it all still lay suspended between death and survival. Inside her room, machines hummed faithfully, each beep and hiss a fragile defiance against the narrative that had tried to erase her. Malcolm remained by her side, his back straight, his eyes unwavering, his hand always near hers. He had not left since arriving, not even to eat or rest properly, surviving on sips of water and short moments of meditation when Serena forced him to close his eyes. In those long hours, he studied every rise and fall of her chest, every twitch of her fingers, as if willing her to draw strength from his presence. He knew the world outside was moving quickly now, faster than he could entirely control, but that had always been the nature of truth once unleashed. It spread, it multiplied, it demanded recognition. His task was to keep shaping it before those in power could twist it again. The case against Officer Philip Miller and his accomplices advanced with unusual speed. The video evidence, the leaked documents, the uncovered memos signed by Mayor Evelyn Brock, all of it converged into a story that no court could ignore. The Justice Department, pressed by mounting protests nationwide, dispatched a civil rights task force to Rosefield. Federal agents moved quietly through the precinct, seizing servers, locking cabinets, pulling hard drives from their sockets. The local police chief tried to object, but the footage had already undermined him beyond repair. He too became part of the widening circle of culpability. When the trial finally opened, the courthouse became a stage for the nation. Lines stretched around the block, citizens clutching signs with Amara's drawings reprinted upon them. Families of other disabled children, once silent, now stood together, their presence a living rebuke to the policies that had targeted them. Television vans cluttered every corner, their satellite dishes rising like mechanical trees into the sky. Commentators spoke with a mixture of outrage and awe. A small Georgia town had become the epicenter of a reckoning that would ripple across the country. Amara entered the courtroom not on her own legs, but in the wheelchair that had carried her the day she was shot. Her body remained fragile, her movement slow, but her posture was upright and her gaze steady. The hush that fell over the room as she was wheeled inside was not mere courtesy, it was reverence. People had seen her fall, had seen her blood stain the concrete, had seen her art scattered like discarded prayers. Now they saw her return, not as a victim carried in silence, but as a witness who refused to vanish. On her lap rested a small whiteboard with a marker, her chosen voice for the moment. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. The video footage played first, raw and uncut. Amara's hands moving gently in rhythm to an unheard song, the officer's shout, the sudden blast of the gun, the collapse of her small body. The courtroom shuddered with the sound, some turning away, others pressing fists to their lips. Then came the documents Serena had unearthed, authenticated by forensic analysts, manuals describing erratic gesture patterns as signs of gang communication, memos urging officers to respond with force, contracts signed in secret between the city and Helix Dynamics. At the heart of it lay Captain Harold Wells' authorization, his digital signature glaring across the screen for all to see. Robert King stood before the jury, his voice calm but heavy with truth. He did not need rhetoric. The evidence spoke for itself. He explained how the system had been built not to protect, but to classify, how the language of a child had been mistaken for violence because profit demanded a justification for force. He reminded them that silence had always been used as a weapon, silence of oversight, silence of accountability. silence of those who saw and chose not to speak. This time, he told them, silence had been shattered. The defense tried its familiar strategies. Miller's attorneys claimed he had acted in fear, that the algorithm had convinced him he was in danger, that the fault lay with technology, not the man who pulled the trigger. They tried to shift blame toward Helix Dynamics, toward the city's leadership, toward anyone but the officer whose finger pressed the trigger. But the jury saw through it. They had already watched the footage. They had already seen a child in a wheelchair, unarmed, singing with her hands. When the prosecution called Amara forward, the room stilled once again. She wheeled herself to the front, her movements small but determined. She lifted the whiteboard from her lap and wrote in large, steady letters, "I was signing." She turned it to face the courtroom, her eyes meeting those of the jurors one by one. Then she erased it slowly and wrote again, "I will not die in silence." The message was simple, but its weight was immeasurable. It did not need translation. It was the language of survival, of resistance, of a child whose voice had been denied but not destroyed. The jury deliberated less than a day. The verdict came back clear, guilty on all counts. Officer Philip Miller was convicted of aggravated assault with intent, reckless endangerment, and violation of civil rights. Captain Wells faced separate charges of conspiracy and abuse of power. Mayor Evelyn Brock, though not seated beside them, was indicted within hours of the verdict for her role in authorizing the program. Helix Dynamics lost its federal contracts by the end of the week, its name already becoming synonymous with the failure of a system that had turned suspicion into policy. Yet the trial was only the beginning. Across the country, states suspended contracts with similar companies. Congressional hearings opened, their chambers filled with advocates who carried Amara's drawings into the record. Schools announced new electives in American Sign Language, their administrators admitting publicly what they had once ignored, that silence was not absence, that difference was not danger. Parents filmed themselves signing, "I love you" to their children, posting the videos with hashtags that spread like wildfire. Teenagers wrote, "Hands are not weapons," across their arms in black marker and uploaded photos in solidarity. Amara returned to the hospital after the trial, but she no longer belonged only to her own small circle. She had become a symbol of something far larger than herself, though she never sought it. Her sketchbook, recovered and carefully bound, now contained not only her drawings but also the signatures of those who had marched for her, strangers who had become part of her story. Each page carried both her private imagination and the public movement it had inspired. One evening, as twilight folded across Rosefield, Malcolm sat by her bedside, the silver ring of her mother resting on the table beside him. Amara stirred, her eyes opening to the fading light. She reached for her marker and whiteboard, but then paused. Instead, she lifted her hands, slowly, painfully, and began to sign. Malcolm watched, his throat tight, as she shaped the words. "Am I still me?" He leaned forward, his forehead against hers. His answer not in words, but in the tears he had denied himself for days. She was more herself than ever. She had forced the world to see what it had chosen to ignore. Later, Amara chose to speak to the world again, this time through a live stream. There was no music, no subtitles, no edits. Just her wheelchair, and her hands. Millions watched as she signed the words that cut through the silence of generations. "I am not dangerous. I am different." That alone was enough to make them afraid. They tried to take my voice. But my voice is not sound, it is sight. My voice is movement. My voice is survival. The feed spread across every platform, reshared, replayed, translated into countless languages. It was not a performance, it was testimony. By the 6th minute, more than 10 million viewers had tuned in. Teachers paused their lessons to project it on classroom walls. Parents gathered their children around screens. Activists carried it into rallies where thousands signed along in unison. Even in halls of power, where indifference had once reigned, legislators found themselves unable to look away. For once, the country did not avert its gaze. In the weeks that followed, the Harper Code, the platform Serena and Malcolm launched in Amara's name, became a map of hidden stories. Families of disabled children submitted testimonies of harassment, wrongful arrests, suspensions, beatings, all previously buried under excuses. Each pin on the digital map marked another life treated as a threat for daring to exist differently. What had begun as one girl's tragedy became a chorus of voices no longer willing to be dismissed. And so the new language spread, not just the technical language of law, not just the signs of hands moving in defiance, but the language of recognition, of a country forced to acknowledge what it had chosen to ignore. In courthouses, classrooms, and living rooms, people began to learn words they had never spoken before. They learned to say, "I see you," with their hands, to replace silence with connection. Amara, still healing, still fragile, sat once more with her sketchbook. On the first page, she drew a girl in a wheelchair, not flying, not running, but standing firm with her palms raised to the sky. Above her head fell stars, and in her hands they gathered like fire. Beneath it she wrote in her careful, uneven script, "Even the quiet can catch fire." It was not just her truth anymore. It was a truth the world could no longer ignore. The courtroom had delivered its verdict, but the real judgment was already unfolding across the nation. Silence had stopped meaning surrender. Now it meant resistance. And in that resistance, a new language had been born, carried not by sound, but by hands that refused to stop moving, by a child who had been told she was a threat and who answered by becoming a beacon. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another powerful journey, and check out the others on the channel for more stories like this. And please, share this video with someone who needs to hear it.